Hi Hannah, it's a pleasure to be talking to you
Likewise.
about the Radar Commission. Before we discuss the music in more detail, tell me about this location because you are at Upcycled Studio,
So
where you
I,
spend a lot of time.
I'm in my favourite place, which is our recording studio, which we built in a disused shop. So it's all been a big labour of love for us, and it's been set up now for about a year and a half. So here I'm in the live room, and upstairs is our control room. And it's all very sort of DIY vibes. Everything here is recycled, reused, down to the paint on the walls and the baffles behind me. Everything we could recycle, we have. And yeah, most of the time we are producing other people's music. We do albums, EPs, documentaries, films, that kind of thing. So it's really nice to be here recording something I've written today. So I'm excited to get going with that.
What difference has it made to your life as an artist to have your own studio?
I can't even put it into words. It's just so incredible to have creative space. And actually, we are here through an organisation called Fusion Arts, who teamed up with us to work on disused spaces. So we're based in Oxford, which is one of the most unaffordable places to live in the entire country, and definitely even harder if you're trying to do creative stuff with your life. So Fusion work with artists to take over disused spaces, revamp them, give them some new life, and give artists a place where they can work. So the last year and a half, we've done so much more than I could have even imagined, just through having somewhere to be, somewhere to create. Especially in lockdown, it's been incredible. We were just, the first lockdown, we closed the studio and we were just here every day, wrote a whole album, made a whole bunch of different contraptions. That was actually when most of this modular synth, which is going to be in this piece, got built. So yeah, we have a great time here. We're always working on new things and the space is great.
I imagine it must be very significant to be able to work whenever you want to not have to book studio time, but to have access to a creative space when the moment calls.
Yeah, massively. Particularly good for me as I have an immune condition, which means my life is slightly difficult scheduling wise. So it just allows me to be really flexible and to work when I'm up to it. And also means that we can do a lot of work supporting other artists who can't access space in an affordable way. So we run a little label where we sort of incubate artists at the beginning of their careers, helping them find their sound, helping produce them. So it's really nice. And we also run gigs here as well. So it's really nice to be able to share this space as well as use it ourselves.
Great. Let's talk about the Radar Commission. The thing that which jumps out is this blend of acoustic and electronic sounds, the piano that you're sitting at, blending with the modular synth, nice bits of programming that I heard. It's got a really, really nice groove, which just builds and then some more unexpected stuff happens. What was the general concept behind it?
So it sort of came from two places, this piece. Firstly, building on some of the stuff I've done earlier in the year for classical ensembles and modular synth. So I did a couple of classical pieces, which we managed to record in lockdown amazingly in a big warehouse with everyone spaced out in their own little bubble. So those pieces were feeding the classical composition into the synth, as well as various field recordings and things, and kind of creating a dialogue between the acoustic and the electronic. So I wanted to try this with a jazz ensemble to make it a two-way dialogue, because obviously in classical music, what you're feeding into the synth doesn't really change. It's very much like pre-written. Whereas in this context, both sides are improvising. So I wanted to sort of play with the idea of a feedback loop between the soloist and the modular synth. So the modular synth, in the way that we're using it, is mostly around granular delay, which takes the instrument going into it and chops it into little bits and does a whole bunch of different processes to it. A lot of random elements have been built in. So it always comes out sounding slightly different. So I just wanted to play with the soloist. For example, the trombone has a long section, playing with the modular synth, sort of putting things in, getting different things back and sort of being able to create this feedback loop of themselves, really. So you've got these two improvising processes happening on the acoustic side and the electronic side. So it's been a really interesting thing to write for and a good challenge for everyone, including me.
So with that feedback loop, Hannah, stuff going into the modular synth, it sounds really interesting. Is it difficult in terms of timing and coordination?
Not really. There's not really any latency, and the synth is all to click. So everything, well, you can sort of do it in two ways. So half of the pieces has got this pulse, so a lot of the delay will come back sort of in time. So it gives you a different kind of groove to play along to. And then some other bits are free, but it just creates this really nice sort of cloud of sound that you can just move around. And sort of the reason behind that was the second place that this piece came from. So firstly, my orchestra and modular synth experiments. And secondly, a lot of the work I've done recently has been around climate research. And this piece was inspired by microplastic and just thinking about that as one of the big problems that we're facing at the moment. And the way that microplastic sort of disperses and is chopped into ever smaller fragments, but never really disappears and is always retaining a bit of its original form, really is exactly what happens in granular synthesis. So those two sort of processes together have been what have shaped the ideas behind this piece.
Microplastics and music, it kind of makes me think of erosion and mutation, something changing but coming back in a different form, and I can only imagine that being very stimulating for a musician.
It's really been such an interesting piece to write, and it's also a song. So I've been exploring that in the theme of lyrics and looking at sort of the immortality of plastic and how something with such a short use, like the average plastic bag, I learned, is used for 15 minutes and then takes up to 2,000 years to degrade. I just find that mind-blowing. There's such a tiny life and such a long, death. It's a really interesting thing to think and write about. But also the same thing occurs in this modular synthesis where you take this thing that, whatever trombone note, it's just in passing, you've just thrown it there, and then it's caught in this process and spun around, and it lasts so much longer than its original intention. So I really liked that parallel.
Have you always been interested in live electronics or manipulating sound on the fly?
It's something that has built up gradually. So my original background was very much piano based, and then as I've done more and more music and become more involved with production, I've become interested in electronic stuff and gone more into the synth way of things. But writing for modular synth has been something I've done a lot this year. So I'm still learning how to use it and how to write for it in the best way, because it's a very weird beast and has it kind of has its own life. It's so unpredictable. So in a way you can't ever write for it because you never quite know what's going to come out. And it's nice having its own personality in a way, sort of coming into whatever I've tried to write. It will always be different than I expected.
It's interesting though, because with the use of the electronics and the analog and the live stuff, there's nonetheless a very soulful feeling that runs throughout it, which made me think a little bit of that whole generation of musicians who've kind of come out of Robert Glasper's experiment and the meeting of soul, jazz, electronica, which is nothing new. I mean, Herbie Hancock was doing it back in the 70s. The heritage is very rich. Do you think that's part of your musical culture as well?
Oh, definitely. I mean, there's so much. I mean, you've just listed a whole bunch of my influences right there. But so much of the music I like is exactly at that intersection. And I always have been interested in music which experiments and tries things that, even if it doesn't necessarily end up working, I just love the process. And the sort of piling different elements in and seeing how they respond to each other. I love that stuff.
Interesting choice of instrumentation as well. I think a trombone in this setting is not, if you think about who I just mentioned, who we've just been talking about, if they're using a horn at all, it would probably be a saxophone more than anything. And a trombone has obviously a very, very distinctive sound, bassy, bulky, can be heavy, can also be ethereal as well. But it's a different animal entirely.
Yeah, it takes a lot of space, but also because it has such a strong presence, it creates a really nice sort of layer going through the synth and creates it's got just so many timbres, and when you kind of layer them up on top of each other, it just creates this incredible sound. So that's been really fun. Also, the fact it can bend pitches so easily has led to some really fun feedback loops with all sorts of cool clashy harmonies which you couldn't have predicted coming out. So I think I've always loved horns. Maybe that's sort of my more like classical piano life, but I love trombone, trumpet, French horn, just that slightly more mellow sound, which comes, and like brass chorales, another massive love of mine. So I was really excited to work with Tom and his amazing trombone skills.
Fantastic. Let's quickly round off by talking about the lyrics. Did you write them before or after the music?
A bit of both. So the sort of main chorus, the melody came from some words just knocking around. And then the rest of it, I went back in afterwards and spent a lot of time looking at microplastic research and the processes, but trying to write about in these processes that isn't in a way that's not so explicit. So it's very much about, the eternal themes of life and death and erosion and growth. So if you listen to it, Theo, for example, singing the words, had no idea what it was about. And then me chatting to her about the microplastic element, she's like, oh, that's so interesting. I wasn't thinking about it like that at all. So I like the theme of it to be subtle and interesting and interpretable in a lot of ways.